right. Sound check. I see that Chris has already done a sound check on piped in music. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Canhammer TV. Tonight was supposed to be an interview with Carlos Kaiser, which was rescheduled from last week. Unfortunately, Carlos had some work issues come up, and so we have rescheduled till next week. So sorry about the continuous rescheduling, but it is what it is. Instead tonight, instead of taking an early nap, I decided to just carry on with the deep dives. And so we're going to do the next deep dive today, which is on the Vexilla, or the Vexilus Praetor. All right, so we'll get into that in a moment. Big news, GW confirmed today on their community site that the Storm Shield rules will in fact apply to Custodes, more specifically to Custodian Guard, and I presume to characters that can take Storm Shields. So what this means is that the new Storm Shield, instead of just giving you a 3+ invuln, is going to give you a 4+ invuln and a +1 to your armor save. So this is a big change. This means that our Guardians with Storm Shields still have a 3+ invuln, because we still get +1 to our invuln save from our faction rule. So the shield gives us 4+ invuln, and then we get 3+ invuln. And they are now on a 1+ armor save. Now, whatever, that's still a 2+ in function, but when you start adding AP, in effect, that is ignore AP1. And AP2 just gets us onto our invuln, and everything else is invuln. So that's pretty good. Now, we don't know if the points is going to increase. I doubt they're going to change everyone else's points in the Marine update. They're probably going to change people's points the next time the old Municitorum, book comes out, which may be around Christmas or maybe it's after that. We don't really know. But so it's still pretty good. The corollary to that, of course, is that things like Smash Captains, for example, are now just 4+ invuln, 3+ save going to 2+ save. That's not a big deal for us. It's the 3+ invuln that used to really make things hard to kill, and now 4+ invuln is way easier to kill. All those new Marine dudes who have 4+ invuln, way easier to kill than 3+ invuln. So that's good if we are one of few factions left with actual 3+ invulns. That would be cool. Of course, the gap is closing between your basic Primaris Marine and a Custodian Guardian. Closing in terms of toughness, not really in terms of points. So, something to give us a leg up, I guess. We'll see how it goes, but that's interesting, and that has come to pass. Initially, people were spazzing about it. Then they said this is just for Space Marines, and then they kind of now said it's for everybody have Storm Shields. So there you go. So that's interesting. Now, other Imperium factions that have Terminators who can take Storm Shields will be the same. So they'll be on 1+ save, but they'll only have 4+ invuln because they don't get +1 invuln like we do. So that will be not as bad as if they all had 3+ invuln, which was hardcore. So things like Deathwing Knights, for example, all would have 3+ invulns. Now they're all going to just 4+ invulns with a 1+ save, but as I say, not that huge deal. So that's pretty good. Makes them easier to kill in combat anyway. Makes them much harder to kill outside of combat, but in combat for us, not that much difference. Better. Okay, anyway, won't talk about that much more, but we'll have to see how that develops over time. Tonight's t-shirt is, shout out to Riven, aka Scary, Berry Bash. Now, I don't know if Berry Bash is going to happen this year. It's usually around January, February. And speaking of things, school starts this week for my daughter. School started last week for many other people, and there's been some flares. So let's see how the world goes. But it's a little bit nerve-wracking right now. Okay. So we're going to dive right into the unit deep dive for the Vexilus Praetor, or what I will now just call the Vexilla. The Vex, Vexilla, all sorts of names for it. Banner Boy, Banner Monkey, Homer Jockey. These are some names I've heard for the Vexilla, but basically it's the Vexilla, and we're going to deep dive into this one unit. Okay. The Vexilla is an interesting unit. There's not a lot of things like it in the game. Like, there's a lot of characters that give buffs, but there's not a lot of things that buff -1 to hit. The Dark Shroud comes to mind. Just trying to think, and maybe if you can think of some and you're watching right now, what things give out -1 to hit auras. It's not that common. There are -1 to hit army rules, and lots of other things are -1 to hit just specifically under datasheet. But just as an aura, a 6-inch aura of -1 to hit, there's not too many things I can think of. And so it's pretty unique in that way. And then the other thing that's unique about it is that it's a character, it's an infantry guy, who you play a strat that is for your unit, but is reliant upon this other unit in order for that to go off. There are not a lot of strats that do that. I think it might, the Homer Stratagem is one of the few strats that does that, other than, say, the Dark Angels one that basically just copied us and is not as good. It's a pretty unique little guy. And so in that way, it's always difficult to encapsulate all that a Vexilla brings to an army. But we're going to try our best tonight. We're going to do our deep dive in the same format as we have for the other deep dives. And some of it will overlap because he is a character, even though he's not an HQ. And so some of the things will be very similar. And so we'll just gloss over those parts that are similar. But we'll try and talk in depth about Vexilla, what we think about the options for the Vexilla, and we'll try and be as detailed as we can. And then we'll end up obviously talking about lists, and how to use the Vexilla to its max effect. Okay, before we get into that, modeling tips. Okay, so there are two Vexillas, unless you like custom make your own. There's the Vexilla that comes in the Warden kit, like this dude, and there's the Vexilla that comes in the Guardian kit, like this dude. I highly, highly recommend you magnetize both arms on all your Vexillas, because you will need to switch things around frequently on the Vexilla. So all my Vexillas are magnetized, both arms. And so you can switch things around. Now, the other thing to note is that, it doesn't really matter if you use a Guardian body or Warden body, or if you mix and match. Who cares? Doesn't matter. The Vexillas are all right-handed. So therefore, your weapons need to be left-handed. Now, where do you get left-handed weapons? Probably never thought about that until you have to make your left-handed Vexilla weapon. You need the Warden box for left-handed weapons. So, left-handed axes, like this dude, only come in the Warden box. Left-handed spears, I believe, are only in the Warden box. The daggers you can get daggers in, I think, the Guardian box as well. But the spear and axe left-handed, definitely only the Warden box. So you need a box of Wardens or sprues to get the left-handed weapons. So magnetize, magnetize, magnetize. So for both these guys, I have right and left spears, left-handed axes, and daggers. So magnetize, magnetize. So at the drop of a hat, you can just switch your weapons around, and obviously get one left-handed shield. Okay, so that's basically my hobbying tip for you guys. When you're building your Vexilla, magnetize everything and get those left-handed weapon sprues from the Warden box. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Vexilla. We're going to talk about both versions tonight, the normal Vexilla and the Alaris Vexilla. We're not going to talk too much about the Alaris Vexilla. When it comes into play, we'll talk about it. But most of the time, I'll be referring to the normal foot Vexilla. There's not a lot of reasons to take an Alaris Vexilla. Let's see, what are some of the reasons that you'd want to take an Alaris Vexilla? Number one, you want one more wound. You're paying somewhere between 5 points and 8 points more for one extra wound. You want to be able to deep strike your Vexilla for free. So the Alaris armor allows you to do that. Otherwise, you can pay a CP to deep strike your Vexilla. Generally, as we'll go into later, it's not super great to deep strike the Vexilla, but depending on what you want the Vexilla to do in your list, you might consider it. And finally, if you want the Terminator keyword for certain strats, which you probably won't. So there's not a lot of reasons to pay the extra points for an Alaris Vexilla, except for maybe the extra wound. The cons of taking the Alaris Vexilla, you spend the extra points, which you might not want to spend. The Vexilla is often the place in terms of his weapons where I will first cut points when I need a few points here and there. And he gets no weapons. For some reason, he just comes with the grenade launcher, and that's it. And if you want, you can pay 3 points for Misericordia. He has no option to take any other weapons. And just like the Alaris Captain, he is not Alaris keyword, so we can't use any of the Alaris stratagems or anything. So, you know, it's kind of like not really worth it. But, you know, there's the option. I think the only reason really to run the Alaris is if you have the points and you want to give him an extra wound. If you got 5 points left over, give him an extra wound. Who knows? That might come in handy. But really, there's not really many other reasons to run the Alaris. So we're not going to talk about the Alaris too much tonight, except when it becomes a point of interest. Okay. So we're going to go through the same headings this week. So we'll start with keywords. So he is a character, he is infantry, and of course, if you run the Alaris version, he has Terminator keyword. This is our only non-HQ character. And what'd be interesting is if he was an HQ, would that change anything? What would free up an elite slot? You could run potentially detachments with just him as the HQ and no captains. So that would be interesting. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's probably not going to change, but he is an elite slot, so he does take up one of your precious elite slots. Obviously, as a character, he gets character protection. He can heroically intervene, all those usual things. One of the things that would be super cool, and we all have these in our Custodes dreams at night, is a Vexilla on a bike, or like a Venatari, like jump pack Vexilla. Wouldn't that be cool? But I don't think it's ever going to happen. That would be sweet, and that model would be sick. But anyway, it reminds me of the Ravenwing guy with the big banner. That was a really cool model. But anyway, so no surprises. He does give us the option, even though he's elite, obviously he's character, so he can run Warlord traits and relics, and so we'll talk about all those later. Office being infantry, he's free to move through breachable things, and so he's quite mobile, even though it only moves 6 inches, of course, like all infantry. And of course, he is infantry, so he can Tanglefoot. And in some lists, maybe in some of the older school heavy vehicle lists, but I've seen some vehicle lists flying around these days, he may be one of your few infantry access to Tanglefoot, so keep that in mind. All right, that's keywords. Stats-wise, he's pretty standard custodian, except that he has 5 wounds, 6 on the Alaris Terminator. Other than that, his stat line is exactly the same as everyone else's. Shooting, again, the same. If you have a spear or an axe on him, you have the weapons, just like everyone else. Nothing too unusual there. Combat. Okay, so his combat potential really depends on what weapons he has. So he only has 4 attacks, so he is 1 less attack than a captain. So as much as we were talking about how captains can be fairly unreliable at times, he's even much less reliable with only 4 attacks. Even if he gets a Misericordia and gets that 5th attack, if you're pairing it with a shield, he doesn't even get that 5th attack. So, you know, he's not like a beat stick gonna kill people sort of guy. He's got enough attacks to take on 5-man chaff units, to take that extra 1 or 2 wounds off something if you really need it. But he's not going to be the guy you run around bashing into people just because you think he's going to kill things, because usually he doesn't. So for that reason, there's definitely lots of potential in just making him super tough with a storm shield. Maybe the dagger if you have the 3 points. If you don't, the dagger is one of the first things to go. And then he doesn't really do anything in combat. Just no big deal. But it's not a lot of points to get a dagger or to give a spear to the guy. But, if you give a spear, you're giving up the 3 plus invuln. So, what weapon you put on him really depends on what points you have and what you want your Vexilla to be doing. If you have no intention of putting this guy into combat, you may not want to spend the points on a weapon and just make him tough with a Storm Shield. My default configuration of the Vexilla is a Storm Shield and a Misericordia. Because I don't feel like he hardly ever has to kill anything, and it's definitely nice to have a 3-up invuln. So there we go. But if I really need the points and I don't want to drop anything else, the first thing that goes is the Misericordia and then maybe even the Storm Shield for a spear or something, and he just goes around the 4-up invuln because it doesn't seem to actually matter too many times. So that's one thing to keep in mind. With a Storm Shield, he's fairly hard to kill. He's got, 5 or 6 wounds. He's -1 to hit at all times because of his own banner. And he's got 3-up invuln, 2-up armor save. So he's fairly hardy kind of character to leave on a middle objective in the open. Again, shooting bait sometimes. So he's in a similar role as a captain or Trajan in that way. He can be left once his banner is no longer that useful. And so this is definitely one way of using the Vexilla. So at the end of the day, you're not a blind builder. I will be getting to your question later. At the end of the day, you're not taking the Vexilla to kill things most of the time, except maybe in like an ultra smashy Dreadhost list. You're taking the Vexilla for the banner and for Homer. And so it doesn't really matter if he doesn't shoot or kill anything. A lot of the times he's advancing, so he's not going to shoot anything anyway. And it's just like, just make him hard to kill seems to be a good way of running the Vex. But if you are trying to make him smashy, you can easily make him a little bit smashier. Give him an axe. Give him the Dreadhost 3 damage axe, and then give him a Misericordia for that extra attack. So now he goes up to 4 attacks with 1 with the Misericordia. He'll do some damage, but still not as much as a captain. So it's still not even that great to make him smashy. So I wouldn't put too much resources into making him smashy. But it can be done to make him a little bit of a more threatening character. Okay. Abilities and rules. Okay, so like with everything, he is OPSEC. And like with the captains being OPSEC and Trajan being OPSEC, that is amazing. To have a hard-to-kill character, to be able to sit somewhere or go steal objectives being OPSEC. That comes into effect many times, mid to late game. And it's so good, forces your opponent to try and do something when he's sitting in the middle, just one dude with a banner saying, come get me, OBSEC. And native -1 to hit, 3 plus invuln, is really a solid contributor to mid to late game objective holding. So the OBSEC rule is so key there. The Alaris Vexilla, of course, has the ability to native deep strike. This is a double-edged sword, so while it's awesome, you'll be able to deep strike him and further up the field. You don't have to worry about advancing him and him getting shot. You might get screened out, especially if your opponent starts to push up. You might get screened out. The other thing is, he's often, the reason you want to get him further ahead is so he can homer, and you can't homer on the turn you come in. So you're really planning an extra turn in advance. So you're homering at the earliest turn 3. So that is a real downside to taking the Alaris version. And as I've shown many times, if you move and advance him over the span of a couple turns, you can get him mostly to where he needs to go without needing the deep strike. So, I think the use of deep strike is pretty limited. And then the final thing is, if he's in deep strike, he's not on the field giving you banner. So that is obviously one reason why you take him. So that is a big downside. Okay, so his final abilities that he has are the Vexillas themselves, the banners. So, first of all, don't forget to reroll morale. It rarely comes into play, but when it does, you'll be glad you have that if you're within 6 inches. Nobody wants to lose a 50, 60, 70, 80 point model to morale. That just sucks ass. It's happened to me before. I've lost a bike to morale that's 90 points. Nobody wants to do that. And we're all leadership 9 except for the Guardians that are leadership 8. And it's very rare that you're going to lose to morale, but if you do, you'll have that reroll, and it's even more super rare that you'll fail your morale twice. So, and you should never need to use 2 CP to auto pass your morale. That's painful. So don't forget that part of the Vexilla rule. Okay, so we'll go through the 3 Vexillas. So Defensor is 20 points. So, 20 points on top of the Vexilla. This was obviously made, until recently, made for souping. So Imperium, infantry only, get a 5-up invuln. We don't need it, obviously. We already have a 4-up invuln. And so the real thing was for guardsmen or admech or these people to have 5-up invuln. Now, it's a 9-inch aura, which is okay to fit things in, but it's units wholly within. So it makes it a little bit unwieldy to use and difficult to use, and that's why you've not seen it very often. Also, back then, it was much easier to just splash in the Vex or something, but now it costs you points and CP and detachments and things to splash in this ability. So it's generally not worth it, and so people did not use it. And we, as a faction, don't need the Defensor. Now that we have sisters around, you could run the Defensor to give your sisters 5-up invuln. I don't think you ever want your sisters in a position where they would really benefit from sticking around the Vexilla to have a 5-up invuln, personally. Your sisters are doing different things. They're nowhere near the Vexilla most of the time. It's not really a thing that you want to constrict your play to keeping your sisters within 9 inches. It's generally not that useful. So even though it would apply to the sisters, it's just not really a thing that you find you need to do very often. So really, the Defensor is our least useful Vexilla. But it was our cheapest. Now, the Imperius is the next one. The Imperius used to be like 50 points or something like that, which was stupid. Nobody ever took it because it was 50 points, which is crazy. And then it got chopped to 20 points, and then everyone started using it. 2 Vexillas. We had 1 -1 to hit and 1 +1 attack banner. And that was fun for a time, running the double Vexilla. So this is I got hair in my face. This is a +1 attack 6-inch aura banner, and that's great. Why not? More attacks. It kind of takes the sting out of losing 1 or 2 guys, losing a guy in Overwatch, so you don't have to avenge the fallen. It takes the sting out of those initial early losses to have that extra attack, and that's fine. Nowadays you've got -1 to hit from terrain, so there may be less need for the -1 to hit aura. Well, I'm coming to that in a second. So maybe you consider taking +1 attack. The problem with that, though, is that +1 attack is often just, you don't need that many attacks. Maybe if you're splitting your squad and you're trying to kill 2 knights, you could do with an extra attack. But under most normal circumstances in the course of a game, you don't need an extra attack. And so it just seems like overkill. And whereas the -1 to hit is almost always useful. So, I think it's worth toying around maybe in the future. Obviously, it's going to be good, but is it better than -1 to hit is the question. So, and I think these days with points being such a crunch, I think and elite slots such a crunch, we're not likely to take double Vexilla anytime soon. So it's really a choice between the two, and I still think the -1 to hit comes out on top. So then the last banner is the Magnifica, which of course is 30 points. It's our most expensive banner, and it is -1 to hit aura. -1 to hit, even though it's been capped, is still super strong. Super strong. There's whole armies out there who get neutered by -1 to hit. Guard is the perfect example. They're only 4+ to hit at base. Now you take them to 5+ to hit. It just wrecks them. Even their tank commanders are 3+ to hit. Now they're 4+ to hit. The whole Marine faction, by and large, 3+ to hit. Now 4+ to hit. great. Having their hits, right? Like, it's just amazing. Tau without marker lights, 4 up to hit, now going to 5 up to hit. Like, AdMech, 3 up to hit by and large. It's like -1 to hit is so good. It just cuts the amount of firepower coming in at the very first cut. If you don't believe me, go to a GT, okay, 5-6 rounds, get a piece of paper beside you and put a mark on every single roll that your Vexilla saves you a hit. You'll see how many marks are on that paper by the end of each game and by the end of the 2 days. You'll see how useful it is. And then add that all up in terms of damage. It's a lot. So -1 to hit is still super, super strong. And so using the -1 to hit banner and keeping your guys in it is still a very, very strong strategy. And now that the stacking has been stopped, you actually see much less of it. So it becomes more powerful, so to speak, that people are not like preparing for a spam of it. I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but if it's not out there a lot, then people don't prepare for it as much. There are still a few abilities out there that trigger on modified 6s, Tesla being one. Now, who knows if that changes in the Necron book coming up very soon. But your Vexilla basically shuts off all Tesla. They cannot Tesla with -1 to hit. It's hardcore. And so there's still a few abilities that are not unmodified 6s yet. I think most of them are going that way. Plasma, up until the new changes, of course, fucked by -1 to hit, right? Nobody wants to overcharge with the -1 to hit around. So these things are probably soon going to disappear, but until they do, it's still good for that. Okay. So points. So the points are all fairly similar. Your Vexillas are all falling somewhere between 120 and 130 points. That's with the Magnifica, okay? It's 120 for just a spear, and it's 125 for the axe, so 5 points more for the axe, or for a shield with no dagger. It's 128 for a shield with a dagger. That's my default build. And also 128 for the Alaris with a dagger. Only 125 without the dagger. And of course, the Alaris cannot take any other weapons. So you're talking anywhere from 120 to 128 points for your Vexilla of choice. So that is a pretty reasonable price. Not so much for all the other stuff, but really for a hard to kill character who does all the things we just talked about and gives you this aura, and then is your Homer jockey. So, that's a pretty decent price for such a hard to kill character who does all those things. So we talked about the Alaris again. So, for the same price between an Alaris and a dagger with a shield and dagger guy, you actually get your 3-up Embalm instead of just a 4-up on the Alaris, and you still get the dagger. And so again, I don't see a lot of reason to run the Alaris guy. 3-up Embalm way better than 1 more wound, so it's just generally not a lot of reason to run the Alaris guy. Okay. Comparables. I could not find a lot of comparables for this very unique part of our army, so I won't spend too much time talking about comparables. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind throwing out -1 to hit auras is the Dark Shroud. I know the Sisters is -1 to hit it with a Stratagem, but, I think it's just like, I think there's not a lot of comparables, so I didn't spend too much time trawling through armies for comparables. So Mark's just making a point that the +1 attack kind of combos with like +1 attack is good, and that a lot of armies now are running 3-up Embalms and things like that. Yeah, so I still think that -1 to hit comes out on top, but as I said, they're both good, and the Defensor is definitely the last one. I think it may be a meta decision for some people. So if you're playing against lots of armies, running lots of invulns, then maybe more attacks is better. I think if you're playing against a lot of shooting armies, then -1 to hit is going to be better. At the end of the day, is it more important to survive or to hold objectives? It kind of really depends on the meta in which you're playing. So yeah, good points, Mark. Okay. Warlord. So, of course, he is a character. He can be made your Warlord, and he can be given a Warlord trait if he's a Warlord, or also by using 10,000 heroes to give him a Warlord trait. So the big question, of course, is, do you make him your Warlord? So, before our book, the Vexilla was my Warlord. He definitely was. He was my Warlord before because he was my character least likely to get killed. And back in the day when Slay the Warlord was a thing, both in ETC and ITC, he was my guy who had a 3-up invuln, who often was not in the middle of the action and could not give up Slay. Now that Slay the Warlord is not really a thing, I think it really actually matters very little who is your Warlord, except that your Warlord will get a free Warlord trait. So if you don't have to, right now, I really like to put a Warlord trait on my Shield Captain and give him the Feel No Pain. So by default, that makes him the Warlord. And so the Vexilla is not the Warlord. But if you want to give your Warlord a Warlord trait and you don't want to give a Warlord trait to anyone else, or you don't mind spending a CP on an extra Warlord trait for someone else, then make your Vexilla the Warlord. It's not really a big deal, I don't think, anymore, who your Warlord is, especially if you have the ability to spend CP to get extra traits. In the old days, that was a pretty decent Warlord. He's -1 to hit, 3-up invuln is a pretty hard to kill Warlord. But, I think it probably doesn't matter that much. Okay, so when do you want to put a Warlord trait on him? Well, I think you look at the Warlord traits that you could give him, and you have to think carefully, for that CP, is that something that is important to what he's going to do, or what the list needs him to do, or what the list in general is trying to do? And if the answer is that CP is worth spending, then do it. And if it's not, then don't do it. And you have to keep in mind that you commit your Warlord trait now on paper at the beginning of the event. So you can't decide to spend it as and when you go. So you have to make sure that thing is going to be worth it for most of your games, ideally all of them. So that does cut down on the number of Warlord traits that you might consider spending. It's all fine just to say it's just 1 CP, but then 1 CP is 1 CP, 1 CP is 1 CP. So I think that you have to think about this carefully. So let's go through some of the Warlord traits that you might consider putting on him and talk about them a little bit. Okay, so many of them are kind of applied to him just like they would like the Shield Captain, so I won't necessarily go through all of them, but we'll point out some of the ones that I've either used or considered using. So Champion Imperium is what I used to put on him when he was the Warlord, and that was always very useful because he's always at least 6 inches, if not closer to the front line, and so just putting out this big 12-inch HI aura was pretty sweet, and it's a great Warlord trait, and so that's what I used to run on him. Now, of course, with the HI stratagem, and people can hit you when you heroically intervene. I don't heroically intervene that often, but that's still a consideration if you want to play your Vexilla like that. Impregnable Mind, of course, as somebody who's close to the front lines, being able to deny things was great. Of course, now you have to pick that. Same with the captains, you have to pick it at the beginning of the event, and depending on your meta, you may not end up using that often. So it's a meta decision that you can make. Radiant Mantle used to be fun, putting a -2 on your Vex, -2 to hit on your Vexilla. Of course, then people just don't try and attack him. So it's kind of like spending something to deter. Of course, now that it's been capped at -1 to hit, and he's always -1 to hit if you're running Magnifica, this Warlord trait becomes useless for you. Dread Host, All-Seeing Annihilator. So in a pure Dreadhost list, say you're running the old smashy Alaris Cap, and he has to run the Peerless Warrior to get one of the Exploding Sixes, and so you need someone else to run ASA, and so you could put that on your Vexilla. And as long as they're within 6 inches of each other, he will boom bang both of those Exploding Six auras. So there you go. So that's kind of the way to go if you're trying to run that smashy Alaris Cap build in Dreadhost. Otherwise, I mean, if you're not running the Smash Cap, but you still want to hit the most number of units, you could still put your All-Seeing Annihilator on the Vexilla, because he's usually in and just behind your front line. So especially if you're not running like a Shield Cap or something that's maybe more mobile, you could consider running it on your Vexilla. So he's a good target for All-Seeing Annihilator. Solar Watch. So Sally Forth, again, just like you might run it on a captain, you could run it on the Vexilla. It tends to be close to the front line to keep everybody within range of the Sally Forth ability. And then, of course, if he's rocking a spear or a axe, he can do the rapid fire thing too. Okay, so Emissaries is the combo that some people have talked about, that Eric, for example, was talking about. And so the combo works like this. So under Emissaries, the Warlord trait is Voice of the Emperor. So this Warlord trait extends his aura abilities by 3 inches. So his -1 to hit ability, or his Vexilla ability, is 9 inches now instead of 6 inches. Okay, which in and of itself is decent. 9 inches. Radius is an extra 6-inch diameter, and so that extends, I don't know what the math is on that, maybe it's like 30%, but it extends the area of effect by a decent amount. And so if you're just running a Magnifica with this Warlord trait, you now have a much larger area of a -1 to hit aura, which is cool. Now, if you plant your Vexilla for a CP, that adds 6 inches to your Vexilla range. So now you have a 15-inch radius, or 30-inch, plus the size of his base, 30-inch diameter area of effect, which is basically a table quarter, which is huge. So you can have this massive -1 to hit, or +1 attack, or whatever aura that is now 15-inch radius, which is huge. Now, we'll talk a bit later about planting and the downsides of planting, but that is the thing. So then the second part of the combo, if you want to max it out, and this was part of the whole list build of this idea, was then to give him the relic, the Vexilla Dominatus, which we'll talk about now instead of talking about under relics. The relic Vexilla Dominatus replaces the Defensor relic. So you have to buy the Defensor relic. Then you take the Defensor banner. Then you take this relic, which erases that ability, and now becomes an aura of each model counts as 3 in terms of objective holding. So therefore, if you now have ×3 obsec ability, basically, which seems like really cool. I mean, if you have 1 dude on an objective, he now counts as 3 dudes, and everything is obsec. So if you have a unit of 5, those guys is now 15 dudes on that objective, which is crazy. So, and then, as we said before, you could go up to a 30-inch diameter of this super obsec, which nobody's taking those objectives off you. Unless they kill you, nobody's taking those objectives off you. It's hard enough as it is with the obsec that we have. And so now you just tripled it. It makes it really difficult. The only counterpoint to this whole thing is you kind of have to devote at least a detachment, if not your whole army, to this kind of gimmick, and then just kind of run a hold type of list, which is fine, and it probably work, but it is a thing that you have to build into specifically. So that's fine. The other thing is, I mean, in my own play experience, it is not often that I get outheld for more than a turn before whatever outholds me is dead. Now, that turn may be vital, but sometimes it's not. It's not come up too many times where I've been outheld and not been able to do anything about it, where I think a 3 times the number would be so important. So that's my only counter argument against it. Now, I haven't tried it. And some people out there who have tried it need to feedback to me on how important that is, how many times it's come up that has been really important. But I'd like to know, because that's an interesting part about emissaries, is that. As well as the hand objective, hand stratagem. But that's an interesting strategy there to go with. And if we ever see the return of hordes and hordes and hordes of troops, and I mean, Nurgling spam is one thing, but if we ever see that coming back, then maybe running the now newly buffed Storm Shield spam with the emissaries, Vexilla, and everyone being triple obsec becomes a thing that we need to do to outbeat that kind of army. I don't know, but it's an interesting tool for us to have the ability to utilize if we see the meta going that way. Okay. So that covers Warlord traits. Okay, relics. So the question is, how do you spend a CP to give a relic to your Vexilla? How much do you put into your Vexilla? That's the commonest question to get asked about the Vexilla. How much do you put into your Vexilla to make it hittier or harder to kill, or to do this or to do that? I think it really depends on what you're trying to do with the Vexilla, and you have to think about that very carefully. Just like the extra Warlord trait, you need to spend a CP for the extra relic, and you got to think about whether you do it or not. Think seriously. So for example, my list starts with 8 CP. I would love to put a Castellan's Mark on my Vexilla, but I just don't want to spend that CP and start at 7 CP. That's just 1 CP too many pre-game for me. And so I don't. But if you are happy to do that, then you do. I mean, it's really just a matter of play. I find starting the game with less than 8 CP is very difficult as it stands right now. That's my own play experience, and how I like to play. So after you've weighed up the pros and cons, if you really want to spend a CP on a relic, then here are some relics that you might consider or not consider. Again, we won't go through all of them, but we'll just talk about some of the ones that come to mind. So, Raiment of Sorrows. So I've seen people use this relic. This is our kind of fight or shoot on death aura. And you can give it to the Vexilla, because why not? He's usually near people, so it would trigger. And I wouldn't do it. I mean, it's a 4-up aura, first of all, so on a 4-up you can do it, otherwise you don't do it. We have few enough models to trigger this, okay? So we have the fewer number of models in order to try and roll 4-ups. And then you get 1 shot, and our 1 shots are not a lot, or you get 1 single attack. Again, it's pretty crappy, so I wouldn't use the Raiment of Sorrows. Okay, Eagle's Eye is obviously the default way of giving your Vexilla a 3-up invuln if you don't invest in Storm Shield. With the new Storm Shield changes, I would suggest that investing in Storm Shield got even better, because now he's 1-up, 3-up. So there's that. But if you're not going to buy a Storm Shield, you really don't have the points, and you want to still give him a 3-up invuln, then you spend a CP on the Eagle's Eye, and there he has a 3-up invuln. Or if you're running him as a Dread Host and you got an axe and you really want him to kill stuff, but you still want him to be hard to kill, then you spend the CP on 3-up invuln. So it's there for you if you need it and you haven't already used it. Personally, if I had the choice, I'd rather pay the points for a Storm Shield than spend the CP on the invuln. I've seen people use Praetorian Plate on an Alaris Vex as a gimmick. Just like with the Captain, it's a bit of a gimmick, and that's a lot of stuff to put into Vexilla just to do 4 attacks. So I generally wouldn't do that. Wrath and Jealous. So this is one of the Vexilla replacement relics. Replaces your Magnifica, which is kind of crappy already, to lose the -1 to hit, which you paid 30 points for. And now you get once per battle a small aura to do 4 on a 4+ D3 mortal wounds. Yeah, that really sucks. That really sucks. Don't do that. Mark says firing salvo launchers on death can be pretty clutch. Yeah, but it's super gimmicky, and if that happens to golf, then yeah, that's cool. But the next relic is Fulmaris Aggressor. I gotta say, this is today when I was writing my notes, this was the first time I'd read that since the book first came out. So this replaces. You got to take the Defensor Relic, then it replaces that, and all you get in return is a -1 AP Flamer and a Misericordia, basically, with like an extra strength. It really kind of sucks. And the only, that's just not something you would take. Okay. The other thing that replaces the relic is the Faith Absolute. So this replaces the Magnifica again, which again, bad in itself. And then it gives you auto pass morale. Now this is for Imperium, so this is another soup relic. So that may be very good if you're running the soup Vexilla, but if you're not, this is pointless for Custodes. And then it gives you the ability to deny a power with no bonuses. It's all kind of meh. Okay, Castellan's Mark. So the Castellan's Mark is definitely a great relic, as we talked about last week. To be able to redeploy is amazing, and I feel like the Vexilla is the kind of a sweet guy to have the ability to redeploy. So let's say, for example, the bike example. Okay, so bikes deploying up at the front, but then you need to redeploy them at the back, but they're still in range to get shot. So if you redeploy the relic, the Vexilla with them, now you can be sure to keep them in the Vexilla range. So by redeploying the Vexilla, you can always make sure it's in range. If you have to split a unit, redeploy it out to the side, then you can put your Vexilla in between them to keep the range. So I really like how the redeploy works with the Vexilla specifically. The few times that I've done it, I think it works really cool, other than sending, bikes with a bike captain, that kind of thing. So I think if you're going to run the Castellan's Mark, the Vexilla is actually a really good target for it, because being able to move the Vexilla to maintain your -1 to hit auras is really nice. And because it's a 6-inch aura, it allows you to kind of daisy chain things out. So yeah, I like that a lot. I like the Castellan's Mark on the Vexilla a lot. Okay, so a couple of the shield host specific ones. So Aquiline Shield, the Praesidius. Hey, Indigo Luke, welcome. The Praesidius is the basically the -1 to wound storm shield that you get with Aquiline Shield. Which, I mean, if you're going for Aquiline Shield and you want to make characters hard to kill, then you give a 3-up invuln guy -1 to wound, and he's already -1 to hit. That guy ain't dying anytime soon. And so if that's your bag, then that's a good relic for your Vexilla. And considering it's either him or a shield captain that takes the shield, I mean, one of those guys is going to get that Praesidius. That's pretty sweet. Dread Hosts at Monomortis. So of course your Vexilla, if you have an axe, can take the flat 3 damage axe from Dread Host. And so if your thing is to get your Vexilla to do some damage, you could give him the axe. He only has 4 attacks, so he's doing less damage than a shield captain with it. But again, if you got all the exploding things, and then it might make up for it. You could also run the +1 attack banner, and then you have your dude who now has 5 attacks base, and then now he's exploding with ASA. So that could do some work as well. So I think if you're running to make your Vexilla as as hard hitting as possible, then you could do worse than giving it an axe to start with, and then if you're running Dread, to do that Monomortis. In a similar vein, if you're running Solar Watch, that relic spear is actually quite nice. In fact, when I first read that, when our book first came out, that was one of the first things I thought of putting this relic spear on, was the Vexilla. Because now your Vexilla kind of does something. For the cost of a spear and the relic, he now has decent shooting, like 4 shots, and he hits the same, and he can fall back and shoot and charge, and so kind of be a general pain in the butt. And meanwhile, toting around his aura, whatever aura it is that you choose. And so that's kind of cool. It's kind of a cool little dude there. So I really liked that idea. And if I was running Solar Watch, I would definitely experiment with that. Okay, and then finally is Emissaries, and as we talked about already before, the Vexilla Dominatus and the whole trick there. So we won't talk about that again. Okay, so that's relics. Okay, strats. Okay, so what strats would you think about using on the Vexilla? Okay, some of the other ones that you could use on any character, we'll stop talking about those every time because it's kind of the same. So Tanglefoot, I'm always going to mention that every time we talk about an infantry thing. Tanglefoot, he is an infantry. You can use him for Tanglefoot. If you're in a vehicle heavy list, he might be your only Tanglefoot source. So Tanglefoot, Tanglefoot, Tanglefoot. Okay, let's skip straight to what everybody's waiting for is Homer. Vexilla, teleport, Homer. Homer is probably the best deep strike stratagem in the game. To be able to get you to just outside 3 inches is like so good. Even the Dark Angels tried to copy us and they failed. It's just really, really good. Before, 3 CP was like, and it's like one time, and so you run Trajan and you try and get your 3 CP back. A free teleport Homer when you roll that D3 was so awesome. Now, if you're running Trajan, it is free, which is amazing. It's one of only 2 3 CP stratagems that we have to spend it on. So it's just amazing, amazing value. And now we also have more CP. You can actually consider homing more than one time. So many people are like, I never get Homer on. How are you ever going to get it off? How is he going to get where he needs to go? I don't know, man. All I can say is you watch my games. I can get the Homer wherever I want to, almost all the time. My opponents know about it. Ask Francois how many times I've homered right in his face, and he knows all about Homer. There's really very little you can do to stop it, especially with the rest of our army on the table. And you just go, you homer your guys down, and they wreck face. Now, you just move in advance a couple of turns, and you're almost always where you need to go. If you roll poorly on advance, you could always spend a CP to re-roll one, or you settle for a 4-inch charge, or a 5-inch charge, or a 6-inch charge. Still better than a 9-inch charge. So I have almost never had too much trouble getting my Homer where I needed to go. The only times when I have trouble is when those freaking Marine infiltrators fuck up your Homer, and then probably you shouldn't depend on a Homer from the beginning and just start in the table. So yeah, Homer is just super, super strong and very difficult to stop. And so it's great. So that is one reason, probably a good enough reason in itself to run a Vexilla. We'll talk about that later. Okay. The other stratagem is planting. So if you plant the Vexilla, you double the aura range, which can be situationally key to survival, or +1 attack. The only problem is you have to have not moved to plant. So you kind of almost have to plan it a turn in advance. So if you can see this kind of situationing happening a turn in advance, you could you could plan it and then not move and then plant. But it does take some planning, so it's not really an oh shit kind of stratagem that you can just use, because probably by the time you think about it, you already moved your Vexilla. So it's hard to play the plant, actually. I've never managed to plant too many times, maybe like a few times. And it's kind of cool, and it's definitely a thing that you plan to do in the Emissaries build. You just move your Vexilla to the center of the field, and you plant your Vexilla every turn, and you just put out this massive aura. So, as I say, if you plan around doing it, you can probably do it to good effect, but it's not an oh shit sort of stratagem because of that stipulation that they can't have moved. And obviously, you can't do it if you're running an Alaris on Determined Deep Strike. Okay. Victor of the Blood Games. So he is a character, so he is eligible for Victor of the Blood Games. In the same way that I was not impressed with using it on a Shield Captain, I would be even less impressed with using it on a Vexilla. So don't need to talk anymore about that. Same with Even in Death. So he can fight on death for 2 CP with Even in Death stratagem, but again, he's doing even less than a captain would in that situation. Unless you're really desperate, you got to take that 1 or 2 wounds off. And you got the CP. It's very situational at best. Okay. Aquiline Shield. Shield of Honor. Okay, so this allows a character, an infantry or a vehicle to protect the character, basically, to eat the shots, eat the attacks. And so while you could use something to protect your Vexilla, I would actually do it the other way around. If you're running Aquiline Shield, give him a Storm Shield, -1 to wound, Relic Shield, and now he tanks for somebody else because he's infantry. He can tank for Trajan or Shield Captain or whatever, and it's going to be fairly hard to kill. So that's a cool little trick if you're running Aquiline Shield and you're running these super hard to kill characters. They can just kind of walk up beside each other and protect each other. So that's pretty interesting. And remember, the Aquiline Shield is not just shooting, it's combat as well. So he can tank hits in combat too. So you can have them just rocking up into combats and like tanking everything, a -1 to wound guy. Like, that's pretty cool. Okay, Dreadhost, Golden Light of the Morades. So if you are a Dreadhost, you have already failed your fair share of 3d6 drop the lowest charges. I guarantee you. Otherwise, you're not playing enough. It's not super reliable as you would hope. So if you really need to, you can still Homer and Golden Light. So now you're making a 3d6 drop the lowest charge only 3 inches away. And if you're Bike or if you have Venatari, you can now get deep. And I guarantee you, even if people know about it, they will not have planned for that sufficiently. So you could really catch some people off with that combo. So in that way, I like the Homer plus the Golden Light stratagem together to really catch people off guard. Okay, and finally, Oromite and Adamantium. Obviously is for Terminators, and so if you have an Alaris Vexilla and you're really desperate, you could put it on them. Okay. So now we're going to go on to the section about lists. So obviously, the question when we talk about lists is the Vexilla an auto take? Can you consider running a list without a Vexilla? I think the answer to this question is always it depends. That's the answer to almost every question in life. It depends. He's pretty damn close to being an auto take in my mind. You have to think of a really good reason not to take him. Really good reason. And we'll talk about a couple of those reasons maybe in a second. If you are planning to deep strike anything with the intention of coming in and doing something, you're going to need a Vexilla because you're going to want a Homer. You might want a Homer once or twice if you're deep striking a couple of units or more. Nothing worse than failing a charge and hanging out in the middle of the open doing nothing. You can actually survive that these days with our new defensive stratagems, yes. So it's a bit more palatable than it used to be, but it's still not ideal. Nothing wants to be doing nothing for a turn in this army, in this faction. So being able to Homer is so key to that. And now that we have tons of CP and recycling and Trajan, I mean, if you're deep striking, you're Homering. These two things go hand in hand. You should not be deep striking without Homering if you can in any way avoid it. And even if you're playing Dreadhost, as I already mentioned. So if you're doing that kind of army, and a lot of people are, you are Homering, you need the Vexilla. -1 to hit. We already talked about how good -1 to hit is. That is a compelling reason for you to slap that Vexilla in almost every list. So we won't need to spend too much more time reiterating that again, but that is a very compelling reason to taking a Vexilla in almost every list that you write. Can you play a list without a Vexilla? Yes. And we have seen them, and they have been successful. And that is part of how good our faction is right now. It's nothing to do with the Vexilla getting worse. It is to do with how much better everything else has gotten at surviving. And so, yes, you can totally do without -1 to hit now. It's really good, but you can do fine without it because everything is very survivable. So it was definitely way more mandatory before our book, now slightly less so. So you can. And you free up, 125 points to do something else. Maybe another HQ, 1 Terminator, 1 Bike. I mean, honest goodness, you don't really get that much for it. 2 Sisters units, maybe a good use for 120 points. A Rhino. I mean, you don't get that much for that points that you freed up, but it can make the difference. But we are seeing some serious increase in Imperium weaponry soon. Melta's becoming much more reliable. 2 damage heavy bolters, AP across the board. Like, it's about to get a lot deadlier out there, and so maybe the -1 to hit becomes more important again. People playing highly mobile lists, lots of bikes, lots of Venatari vehicles, so fast moving grav tanks and flyers. They may not find the -1 hit very useful at all. Maybe it just gives them in the first turn and then the Vexilla is out of the game. So in that way, it may not be that essential for those kind of lists. In the old days when I used to play 18 bikes, the Vexilla was my turn 1 -1 to hit. This was before the days of prepared positions. And then after that, the Vexilla just sat in an objective. It didn't do anything for the rest of the game because the bikes were off. So if you're playing that kind of list, for sure, the Vexilla will be less useful to you. But yeah, even in the days of like the triple Orion, you would have it in such a way that the Vexilla would give you -2 to hit at the beginning and then advance, and they could still be in the -2 to hit or on the second turn, but then the Vexilla became useless. So even in those days. And even with today's more foot-sloggy armies, usually by turn 3, the Vexilla's role now has become the midfield objective holder. You don't need that -1 to hit towards the end of the game. It becomes less important as your opponent's army loses less of its ability to kill you anyway. Your toughness becomes dominant, and you don't need the -1 to hit, and thus you don't need to worry about those ores and stuff. We'll talk about it in a second. But even when you need the Vexilla, it's usually only for the first half of the game. So there are, so it's not auto take, it's not mandatory, but you should think about how you're playing your army if that's the case. Okay, how much do you invest in making your Vexilla tough? That was one of the questions we got asked. I think you invest as much as you can afford. I think there's no downside to making a character super tough, especially one that you're going to have sitting on the middle objective by himself for the rest of the game. I think there's no downside. Yes, Indigo Luke, we talked about that already. There's no downside to that. So giving him 3 invuln, as I already said, super good, especially now that it's a 1-up save as well, very soon. And Misericordia would be the first thing to go, but it's nice for him to be able to at least kill some chaff and things like that. Is it worth spending a CP for the Eagle Eye if you don't have, like we talked about all these things already? I think generally my impression now in 9th, in all the games I've played, is that it's probably fine for him to just have 4-up invuln. But if you can have 3-up invuln and you have nothing else to spend those points on, why not? And it's definitely preferable to spending a CP for the Eagle Eye relic. Okay. How much should you invest in screening him? Well, I think if you're planning on using a Homer, you have to invest in screening him. You can't let him die, or else your Homer is screwed and you have a unit failing a 9-inch charge. I think if you're not homering him, then I think he's still worth protecting because he protects you. So I think screening him is not really a thing that you have to consciously think too much about, because it's something that you should already be used to doing and you should be doing anyway. I think leaving him out in the open is the conscious decision that you have to make voluntarily and not by accident. And we'll talk about it in a second. But I think like with any character that's giving you buffs that are important, you should screen him to the best of your abilities. Okay. So play strategies. So we're going to finish off here. There was a Tactica video way back in the 8th edition Tactica on Homer and how to use your Vexilla to Homer where you need to. Go back and watch that if you're interested in seeing that just played out on the tabletop. If you watch almost any of my games over the last year, you'll see plenty of examples of how to aggressively move your Vexilla into position for a good Homer. There's lots of that out there. If you are planning to Homer, it is something you need to decide at the beginning of the game. The minute you put something into Deep Strike, you need to be coming up with a plan for how you're intending to Homer in that unit. At the latest, you need to decide by the top of 2, if not having decided already. You should have to read the game, where your opponent's going to go, where you're going to go, where you want your Homer unit to go, and you need to get your Vexilla there. And even a couple of bad advance rolls is not the end of the world. You can always reroll one with a CP if you really have to, or you accept a slightly longer than 3-inch charge. But you can generally get to where you need to go with good planning and good movement. And now that the tables are shorter and smaller and there's way more density of terrain and obscuring and things, especially the stupid banner sticking up, then you can generally get him where he needs to go in safety, even without screen necessarily. So you just have to make that decision at the time. But if you're planning on using the Homer, you need to think about that ahead of time. It's not just end of 2 and now you're like, okay, where can I Homer? That's not how you use the Homer. You have to plan the Homer ahead of time. Your opponent, if they're smart, will see it coming and they'll know there's nothing they can do about it. If you are planning on homering and there's 1 or 2 units of infiltrators or some other unit with that kind of anti-deep strike type ability, then you should rethink homering. It is that bad. I mean, it's not worth spending the CP or to spend Trajan on that CP if you cannot do it. So don't get caught out like that. Know those rules and start your guys on the table. So don't. Okay. Don't forget your auras. So same as the captain auras, but more important. I mean, if you don't reroll ones, that might be important, that might not. But being out of -1 to hit can be important, very important. And so you need to always have your 6-inch aura to your Vexilla in mind, pre-measure, especially if you already know where. I tend to move him first if he can, so I know where he's going to end up. Pre-measure your 6-inch auras. Daisy chain back to him if you need. Don't put your wounds on the one dude who's in the 6-inch aura. I've done that so many times. Don't put your wound, when you wound allocate, on the one dude who's keeping you in the aura. Watch your 6-inch aura when you charge, when you pile in, and when you consolidate. Okay, because you'll leave your aura, you'll kill the unit that you're fighting, especially that nowadays with no wrapping, and now you're out in the wind because you forgot to stay within 6 inches of your Vexilla with those little moves. So always keep that in mind, pre-measure, and move with intent to stay in your 6-inch aura. Is a key mistake that I've made many times as well. I'm better at it now than I used to be, for sure, but still make it from time to time. Okay. Usually by the middle of the game, turn 3, beginning of 4, your army is moving past the middle and your Vexilla is no longer vital to your survival. So usually it's at this point where the Vexilla either starts to either stay where he is on a midfield, or maybe drops back and helps to clear stuff that's dropped behind you, or go back to an objective to hold it. This is what he tends to do at that point in the game. It's rare that your Vexilla is going to go charging ahead with the rest of your army. And he's really good at that. As I said, he's 2 up, probably 3 up invul, -1 to hit. I mean, 5-6 wounds. It's fairly a commitment for your opponent to shoot at him and try and kill him and take him off an objective. He can kill small 5-man, 10-man chaff units by himself, not without too much difficulty. And this is a situation where you may consider baiting him out for your opponent to shoot him, in the same way we talked about with Trajan or Shield Captains. Baiting out the Vexilla into the open so your opponent commits a certain amount of firepower to usually fail in killing him, sometimes killing him, no big deal, is a thing. So, and unless they've taken, headhunter, whatever it's called now, the character killing, assassinate, then it doesn't matter if they kill your Vexilla or not. So if they have, then try not to give up the assassinate points. But the baiting the opponent shoot the Vexilla can be a strategy. And you know what? If the whole game your opponent has been like, damn, -1 to hit, stupid -1 to hit, it's been getting frustrated by the -1 to hit all the time, and now he has the opportunity to shoot this guy, is really, really hard to ignore that temptation to at least put something into your Vexilla. So use that to your advantage. Use that psychology to your advantage. Okay. That is my deep dive in the Vexilla. Post your questions on the chat. I'm going to check the Discord. I think I answered most of the Discord questions already, but we'll just check. Okay. When to make the Vex the Warlord? Should we spend CP to give him a relic and a Warlord trait? Answered that already. Is it worth buffing up the Vexilla that you're going to run into the enemy? Answered that. Vexilla teleport homeward still a must use? Answered that. Relic Vexilla for emissaries worth it? Answered that. List without Vexilla worth it? Answered that. I'd like to hear about how much you recommend investing in keeping Vexilla safe. Answered that. Okay. There we go. All right, guys. Any other questions on the Vexilla? So tomorrow night we'll be doing podcast episode 188. This is the rescheduled one from last week. We'll be talking about our prep for this weekend's RTT, and we'll also be talking about 9th edition traps. So join us tomorrow night. We'll be joined by Nick and Francois. Wednesday, Francois is bringing his brand new White Scars army onto the table for the first time. I think he intends to play it this weekend. We'll find out tomorrow night. But that should be fun. He's never played it. I've never played against them, so that should be a fun game on Wednesday night right here on Canhammer TV. This weekend we got RTT. Next weekend we're going to do Carlos's interview finally, hopefully. We'll have another game. And I think the next unit we will cover on our deep dives will be the Custodian Guardians. So we're going to deep dive the Guardians, and we'll also include the alternative weapons, so the Pyrothite and the Adricite Spears. Even though it's Forge World and the book's coming out soon, and I don't want to cover those things, but, we might as well do it. So we'll do Custodian Guardians with the next deep dive, and that's about it. So there seems to be no more questions. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Thank you for subscribing and following here on Twitch and YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you for the patrons and your support. Thank you very much to the patrons. I appreciate people becoming patron. Join the Discord channel. It's right here. It's an active community. We're talking about things all the time. Join it. And thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow night.